Okay, now you should be able to hear me online, whoever you are. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my dissertation research here at PSU. This is actually what I'm going to talk about today as part of a larger project. I'm studying how people make decisions about transportation when they move to a new location. I'm looking at new movers for a couple of reasons. One, they're a very large part of the population. About 1 in 10 households in the U.S. move each year. So we're talking about a large number of people that are very open to making changes to their behavior. We find that a lot of travel behaviors are very habitualized and that they are just repeated without giving it much thought. So when someone moves to a new location, they are considering alternatives, and it's an opportunity for those of us who are interested in getting people to shift modes. It's an opportunity to reach those people effectively. So what I'm going to talk about specifically today is a spin-off from my dissertation research that's looking at how households of different economic means are able to make choices about where they live in terms of transportation and accessibility. We have seen a lot of changes in the last few years even, where we've seen some historical trends that have been around since as long ago as the 1920s start to shift. For the first time, a couple of years ago, cities started to grow at faster rates than the suburbs for the first time since the 1920s. Whether or not this is going to be a permanent change remains to be seen, but there are some people thinking that may be the case, that we're going to see some different urban development patterns in the coming decades. The title of my talk here, this low-income households and barriers to the new American dream, is taken from this book called The Option of Urbanism by Christopher Lineberger. And he talks about this new American dream of urbanism, of people moving back into the cities, into walkable neighborhoods where they can potentially live without cars, or at least make fewer car trips. And he calls it, or he says that the age of Leave It to Beaver is over, replaced by the era of Seinfeld, which of course was set in an urban neighborhood in New York. We've seen a lot of evidence that walkability is having an impact on property values as it becomes more and more desirable to live in a place where you can live without a car. So here's a study by Joe Courtwright that found, using hedonic price analysis, found that people are willing to pay more to live in these walkable urban areas. He used Walkscore, which I'll talk a little bit about because that's one of the pieces of data that I'm using in my research, but found a between $700 and $3,000 increase per Walkscore point, which is quite significant when you're thinking about house values. And then we have this Brookings Institute report that talks about how walkable places perform better economically. They go a little bit further in how they talk about this than Joe Courtwright did, and I think a little bit problematically, because they're basing economic performance only on housing prices, residential and retail rents, and retail revenues. And obviously there's a lot more when we're looking at neighborhood economic performance. And they do acknowledge that places with higher walkability have seen more gentrification and that there are some negatives associated with this. However, they point out that there's, in terms of transit access, people lower income people are still able to access transit. But when we're talking about non-work trips, which is what my research primarily focuses on, the non-work trips to the store for doing social visits and that sort of thing are often not the best suited for transit. So we are talking more about active travel modes as a substitute to the car. So this potential difficulty for lower income people to opt into these, or to move into these locations with higher accessibility is a little bit ironic because a lot of the work that's been done in the area of accessibility and getting people to move into these walkable neighborhoods has been built around this concept of choice, and that we can, that the people we should have, after many, many decades of this suburban development pattern being the standard, we need to be developing some of these, more urban, higher density, more walkable neighborhoods to give people the choice to move into those areas. So people that want to do that can do it. But what we're finding more and more is that lower income people are not able to do that. So in terms of choice, Norm Krumholtz was here was that last week or earlier this week? I can't even remember. But I hope some of you were able to see him. And he talks a lot about choice in terms of a goal of a planner should be to provide choices to those who have the least in our communities. And that's really kind of the opposite of what we're seeing, and some of the research that I'll present today shows that. And here you can see just some evidence of why transportation costs are really important to low-income families. You can see here household incomes. As household income, lower the household income, the higher the percentage of your household budgets are required for transportation. There's just less discretionary income, and upwards of 35% or so of the lower income group's household income going to transportation, according to the BLS. And that's a little bit old, 2000, but I think it's a good illustration of why this topic is so important. Okay, so now getting to my actual study. So I surveyed people in 6 different cities in the US, and I was surveying people who had moved very recently, tried to get them within about a month of their move to a new location. So they got a survey in the mail with a series of questions asking them about their preferences for where they lived, asking about their travel behavior, and many other questions. Again, my focus was on non-work travel because I am interested in sort of the neighborhood trips, and most people, it's harder to locate that close to where you work, especially when we're talking about actual transportation. Like I said, this is a spinoff from my dissertation research that's answering a couple of different questions. 320 surveys, and there's currently a 6-month follow-up happening. So I'll be able to say a little bit more soon about some of these things, especially actual travel behavior, which you'll see later. So these are the cities: Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, Salt Lake City, Denver, and Minneapolis. These were chosen because they all had both bus and rail transit, at least a 2% bike commute share. And I use this as a proxy for overall bike travel, just because this is readily available data. But again, in my research, I'm looking at non-work travel. I wanted places that had at least 150,000 in population, but were not part of metro areas larger than 4 million. So these are the cities that I came up with. Here you can see the basic characteristics of the sample. So, somewhat diverse and representative of the cities that I'm looking at, and a fairly good renter to owner split, which was one concern going in, that I wouldn't get as many renters. So some of the key variables that I'm looking at, just to give you some definitions here. For low income, I'm looking at households below 45,000. When I talk about poverty, I'm looking at household incomes below 15,000. And then I have both subjective and objective measures of accessibility. For the objective, I'm using Walkscore. And one note on Walkscore, well, let me skip to relative accessibility preference. Is I ask people a series of questions about their preferences for housing location. There were, I think, about 25 of them. Some of these preference options had to do with transportation and accessibility. So the relative accessibility preference is taking the overall stated preference and figuring out what percentage of that was a preference for one of these accessibility characteristics. So if someone thought that having a large yard or being in a neighborhood that was neat and tidy was more important relative to accessibility, they might have a lower relative accessibility score. So now that note on Walkscore, I want to talk about how walkability and accessibility are different. And it's a bit confusing because I'm using Walkscore. So walkability is a fairly nuanced concept. It includes many things. This is one definition of walkability. It includes connectivity, linkages to other modes, varied land use patterns, attributes of safety, quality of the walking environment, and the context in terms of what you're experiencing as you walk down the street. So accessibility, very simply, is the number of destinations that you can reach over a given distance by a given mode. So Walkscore, even though it's often talked about in terms of walkability, is not capturing all the things that would go into a larger definition, a more detailed definition of walkability. So when I talk about accessibility, I'm using Walkscore as a measure of that. So I just wanted to make sure that we were on the same page there. Okay, so now some of my research findings. So first, do low-income households that want to live in accessible places have opportunities to do so? So looking at the proportion of respondents who expressed a strong relative preference for accessibility, who ended up moving to a somewhat walkable neighborhood. So this is only looking at a subset of my sample that had these strong preferences. When we look at the higher income respondents, so those making more than $45,000 a year, 76% of them were able to locate. Their new home was in a somewhat walkable neighborhood or location. And this is the Walkscore's categories for walkable, or somewhat walkable, very walkable, and then they have a last category of like a walker's paradise, I think they call it. So this is somewhat walkable means that you can probably do some of your trips without a car. So 76% of the higher income respondents versus 60% of low income respondents. So still a majority of both income groups were able to locate, if they wanted to, in one of these somewhat walkable locations. When we look at very walkable, and this is defined by Walkscore as places where you can do most of your daily travel without a car, we see things that are a little different. So just over a majority of higher income respondents who wanted to were able to locate in such a neighborhood versus only 27% of lower income respondents. So we're starting to see a bit of divergence here. So looking at that in a more complex way where I can control for other variables, I used a binary logistic regression model to control for the cities that the people were in, for the age of the person, the relative accessibility preference, whether or not they owned, and then income. So this is a model predicting whether someone was able to move to a very walkable location. And what this means, basically, is that we can see down here that the model does have a somewhat good fit. If we look at the odds ratio here, that's the key thing to interpret, we can say roughly that a $10,000 increase in household income results in about an 11% increase in the likelihood of being able to move to a very walkable location. And of course, the reverse of this is true. If you go the other way, if you take away $10,000 in income, there's a reduction in the likelihood of being able to move to one of these locations. So what does this mean in terms of its effect on these people? So I asked and answered a couple of different questions to get at that. So here we're looking at whether these barriers these cost barriers to moving to an accessible neighborhood are reflected in expected travel mode shifts. So I asked people to tell me at their previous home and at their new home what their sort of estimated mode share was for their daily non-work travel. So And this is where the new data that I have coming in with my follow-up will allow me to look at actual reported behavior at their new home, whereas this is just people telling me, you know, when you're settled in your new home, how often do you think, or what percentage of your travel will be by bus, bike, walking, and car? So here, everyone across income groups seems to think that they're going to decrease driving in their new home. Whether or not this is true, we'll find out. But there is a significant difference in that the higher income group thought that they would decrease their driving by significantly more than the lower income group. These next two I'm putting up here, but they're not, there's no statistical difference between the two income groups with these. But still interesting to see that bicycling is sort of right around there in the middle. And then with transit, there is a bit of an increase for both income groups. When we look at walking, again, we see this split where the higher income groups are expecting to be doing more walking, and the lower income groups are expecting to be doing less. And that is a statistically significant difference between the two. So I also wanted to see if this was going to have an impact on households' budgets. So I asked a question whether at the new home households thought that they would be, if their household travel budget would be increasing, decreasing, or staying about the same. So what I'm going to show you here is the percentage of each income group saying either decrease or increase. So for the entire sample, there was a fairly even split. 24% thought that their household travel budget would decrease. 21% thought that it would increase. When we start breaking that down by income, the higher income group, quite a few more, so 33% versus 13% thought that their travel budget was going to decrease. So this is the group above 45,000. When we look at the group below 45,000, we see almost a reversal of that. 26% thought that their travel budget would increase versus 13% that thought that it would decrease. If subgroup of the low income group, which is this group in the poverty range, even more striking, 36% of those thought that they would be seeing an increase in the transportation budget. And to do a quick check on this, I also looked at sort of estimates for housing budgets, just to see if possibly lower income people are just more aware of shifts, of increases, and might be more likely to report an expected increase. And there was no difference in the expected housing budget, which gives me a little bit more confidence that there's actually something going on here. And then finally, I looked at a very small subset of the lower income group, which is the group receiving some sort of public housing subsidy. So this might be that they live in public subsidized housing, or they are part of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And here we can see, surprisingly, and keep in mind this is a very small group. This is only about 20 people, so it's hard to conclude a lot from it. But we're seeing here a distribution that's much more like the overall sample, which could suggest that housing subsidies are somehow leveling the playing field and allowing these people to locate in these accessible locations that they otherwise would not be able to. So, to conclude, across incomes, people do seem to want to express a preference for these accessible locations. I saw no difference between the higher and lower income groups in terms of overall preference. So there's clear evidence that low-income households are less able to realize their preferences for accessible locations, as you've seen, and that this manifests itself in increased expected transportation budgets and less walking for low-income groups. And this is one area that I'll be testing with my follow-up survey to see if that holds true for actual behavior and actual expenditures. And then this finding that needs more explanation, more exploration, because it's such a small group, but that these housing subsidies may be leveling the playing field. One downside of this final conclusion is that we're at a time where HUD is cutting their budget drastically due to sequestration. Some reports are saying that about 140,000 current housing choice voucher holders will be losing those. So rather than putting resources into this tool that might level the playing field, we're pulling the rug out from under them instead. But it could definitely potential to be a powerful tool if we can get that turned back around. And overall, I think that what I'm finding here is that equity needs to be a larger part of the transportation and land use conversation. I presented some of this research at a conference a couple of months ago that was primarily housing people, and I think they really get it, and we're not at all surprised by any of this. But I think that talking to transportation audiences about this, I get a different reaction. I think it's not that we're not thinking about equity, but we have, in a lot of ways, what we're seeing with the resurgence of popularity of these urban neighborhoods, it's a success story. We're getting the pendulum to shift, and that's good. We're seeing some leveling off of VMT. We're seeing some evidence that younger people aren't as eager to buy cars and get out there and drive. But we need to look at some of these equity implications of that as these urban areas become more popular and prices are increasing. So with that, I will open it to questions and comments, and look forward to them. Thank you so much. And a quick thank you to those who very generously funded my research. And thank you all again for being here on this late day in the term. Yeah.
I think I should defer to the faculty. Go ahead. Arlie, your comment about level of housing subsidies is on point. Isn't one of the recommendations that you'd make to a mayor or city councilor or planning department is we need to create more of those places, that it's easier to retrofit some other neighborhoods, given the demand so high for these walkable mixed-use communities, than to either increase transit subsidies or increase housing subsidies?
Yes, I think you're right. And a lot of the housing construction that we've seen, and I'm not an expert on housing, but has been at the very high end of the market. When you look at the multifamily housing that's been built in the last 10 years here, it's mostly not targeted at these more susceptible groups. I think one thing that the Housing Authority of Multnomah County, Home Forward, has done in the last, I think just the last 2 years, is they've changed their payment standards for the housing choice vouchers so that there are certain locations that are where prices have been increasing, and that there's sort of a low concentration of low-income households. So they've actually allowed those payment standards to increase in those areas. So that might be one further way that we can open up some opportunity in those areas that are otherwise unaffordable.
I was going a different direction. I mean, what if the policy is to say it'd be cheaper and more helpful to people to provide a subsidy of some kind to erect grocery stores in food desert areas or low-income neighborhoods? It was just, we could accomplish more that way than with for dollar, or providing whatever it is to attract some of the other uses and services rather than focusing on the housing or the transit side.
Yeah, no, that is not something I've given a lot of thought to, but I would guess that it's easier to make the areas where those services are more accessible than to recreate those services in places that are otherwise affordable. So I'm not completely disagreeing with you, but I think it may be more challenging. And then you also run the risk when you then put these services in to neighborhoods that don't have them without protections for lower income households in terms of housing affordability. You may just see gentrification spread further.
Yeah. So I'm really anxious to see the rest of the survey results in your dissertation, because I think it's a great topic, and one that I think deserves more attention. I think one of the questions that you may have asked in your survey is the impetus for the move, right?
Yes.
And so I was thinking in your last slide where you had the anticipated change in transportation costs, depends a little bit on why you might be moving,
Yes.
right? So if you're moving because you have a new job and you're anticipating more income, we know that people with higher incomes tend to travel more anyway. But if you're moving because you have greater need for housing, you have more children or more people in your household, you might have a different impact. So it's sort of an interesting thing to sort of cut this yet another way is and do you see differences across these income groups in terms of why they're moving?
I don't know the answer to that. The only thing that I've looked at so far with that question about what the reason for the move was, sort of had a breakdown of the probably 15 options that I gave people for saying why they moved, and put it into sort of a positive move versus negative move, or somewhat like voluntary versus forced. Yeah, and wasn't seeing, at least in the little analysis that I was doing with that, didn't see much relationship. But I haven't done what you just suggested, which seems like a good idea.
So in the cities you looked at, I'm guessing there's going to be a pretty significant difference in cost of living, say, between Seattle and Salt Lake City.
Yes.
Did you control at all for cost of living in, say, your determination of high income versus low income?
I did not. In my sample, there was no difference between either mean or median income, which surprised me. And I think that that's something that I do need to explore more. The other thing that I haven't done for income is control for household size, and that's it's more commonly done with it's more commonly not controlled for with the low income, high income, sort of $45,000 official cutoff, but with poverty rate, it does go into the calculation. So that's definitely an area where I need to expand.
Okay. Then as a slight follow-up to that,
Yeah.
did you look at all, say, in terms of accessibility in the different cities? Was there a difference in, say, the percentage of low-income households that were able to live in, somewhat walkable or very walkable neighborhoods?
Yes, and a lot of that I think had to do with just some of the cities had higher average walk scores where people were moving in general. But that is an area where I need to do a little bit more digging into the specifics of each city. Because the ones, off the top of my head, the ones that had Denver, Portland, and Seattle were the three with the highest walk scores. Salt Lake City, Sacramento, and Minneapolis had considerably lower overall walk scores for my sample.
Okay.
I have kind of online question that's more or less related.
Okay.
Do you think that, in fact, your selection filter or selection criteria only limited to pretty much west or west coast cities? Do you think would that cause any bias in your finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes my findings not universally applicable. One thing that I have talked to a number of people about is the sort of the West Coast cities, and part of why I didn't want to go with the larger metro areas is that all of these cities do have some fairly suburban areas within them. So you don't have like some older East Coast cities where the city is urban and you don't get into the suburban built environments until you're out into the actual non-city suburbs. Yeah, so I think I would have a hard time making sort of broad claims that would be applicable to some of those other types of cities.
Find any difference between those cities from the data you have looked at so far?
Between the ones that I have looked at? Yeah, some very big differences between walk scores. And I think one of the next steps that I need to do is look at some of these questions that I ask specifically for each city to see if one challenge I'm going to have is that I with a sample of 320, I don't have an even distribution across. So there are probably I probably won't be able to do that sort of analysis for some of the, like Salt Lake City, I got very few from, but for Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis, I think I can start to look at some differences by city.
I mean, what you just said, those places too might be places where there's just a general attitude of more public transportation, or, and how that could affect in the cities if those were oversampled compared to other cities. Just a point I'm sure you've thought about.
Yeah, and a little bit of background. One of the reasons that this is not my primary research question for my dissertation. So what I'm looking at for my dissertation is very sort of person-specific, getting at kind of the psychology of how people make these decisions. So I have more controls on things like attitude than I even know what to do with. That'll come more into play in this next phase of research.
Do you have before travel behavior?
I do. I didn't go with the travel diary, but I have a series of questions that gets at travel behavior, talking about sort of typical mode to different destinations. This question about sort of your just typical mode share or estimated mode share for non-work travel, and then sort of a question just like how often do you use each of these to get at some of the, if you only bike someplace once a week or once a month, to try to get at some of those smaller modes.
Yeah, I was thinking about it in terms of your results about their anticipated change. So if you're already seeing a reliance on non-auto modes, it's for some low income, it might be harder for them to realize a greater change in their behavior, at least in terms of more walking or more transit, than someone who's not doing any of it. And so.
And one thing that's potentially deceptive about the slide I had with the expected mode shift is that the small mode shift around, or change around biking, that's because for a lot of people biking was zero. So, so that looking at the overall picture, you sort of lose some of that nuance.
And you have the Walkscore before, after?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's another really interesting thing to think about in the analysis.
Yeah, and one reason I sort of use the categories of Walkscore, Walkscore has many imperfections, so I'm generally less confident using, saying that a 65 is different than a 69, but I do think sort of looking at the the broader categories of somewhat walkable, very walkable, and car dependent, I trust it more for that.
So one thing, obviously for this you've focused on walkability and Walkscore, but I'm wondering about transit accessibility, and particularly for the lower income households, and whether, and I'm assuming you haven't looked at this yet, but whether there's trade-offs, whether maybe they're moving to places that might have good transit accessibility, but maybe not good walk accessibility. I don't know if those two things are always correlate with each other.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's a really good point, and yeah, particularly some of the I don't know, some lower income housing that's concentrated around, say, some of the West Side Max stations, where there's not much to walk to, but if you're commuting into Portland, you'd have very good transit access for commuting. So.
Arlie, so you in addition to the Walkscore, so you also have the subjective measure of the walkability, right? So have you ever compared, the agreement between the objective Walkscore and the people's subjective assessment of walkability, and how they might influence your final results?
I don't think so. I may have done that at some point playing with the data, but I don't recall. And what I had in here that I took out was looking at whether the subjective scores for people's perception of their new neighborhood walkability was correlated with income, and it was fairly strongly. And actually, so here are just a couple of those that I decided not to show, but here they are. And in some of these instances, sort of rating your new neighborhood as a place for walking, there's actually a stronger association with income than with people's preference. And of course, this is just very simple. I'm not controlling for anything, so take it for a grain of salt. But it's quite telling, I think. And then, yeah. So these are the perceived accessibility.
I think there's also this issue of low-income people walking in environments that aren't very walkable.
Yes.
Right? So we know that they're captive walkers, if you will. And so, again, looking at some of that dichotomy when you get the behavior will be interesting, too, and maybe feeds in a little bit more to support Robert's assertion that transforming the places where they're living might be a more robust policy goal over the long term than thinking about changing the places where affordable housing is available.
Yeah.
Other questions? We've got lots of time.
Oh, well, we do. It's fast. And one thing I also want to do that might get at that question that Robert was talking about a little bit is look at the actual locations in terms of sort of are the lower income households becoming more dispersed, which would make it harder to provide those services in another way.
Does Walkscore give you some distribution then? You can look at the Walkscore distribution across in a wide swath, or do you have to sort of zoom in on location by location?
You can. You can look at, you can do like a distribution chart, or you can look at a sort of a map of Walkscore with these different categories in different colors.
So kind of on the supply side of housing, you could look at the distribution of Walkscore across the distribution of housing affordability and make some conclusions there. I guess that's what Joe Courtwright has done, sort of, in some sense.
With the housing prices, yeah.
And then thinking about then housing needs and housing size, and I mean, it's a complicated question, and I know this is just a sort of a side paper, not the core piece, but there's a lot that you could really delve into that I think would be great.
I have a question. And maybe you answered this with your comments about cognizance of transportation budget versus household budget, but just the idea of like the lower your income or the tighter your budget in general, the more like you're actually even aware. So when you're asking these budget questions, like if you have if you're not counting each paycheck, how do you get less and less cognizant of like, is it less and less of an accurate measure or an accurate self-report measure for people who aren't like, okay, I know my line item budget. And I'm not familiar with like the literature on household budgeting in general, but just like how accurate are those measures of people self-reporting? Yeah, and
that is definitely a concern, and I think there probably is some of that. I haven't gone out to look to see whether that's been measured, and that, like I said, the only thing I can sort of defend that with is that I also looked at the expected housing, sort of overall housing cost change, and there wasn't a difference between the two. But housing costs are generally more known to people anyway, so that's not a great test there.
There is a literature on that, and I think summarily people don't know anything about their time budget, their distance that they travel, or the money they spend.
Walking also includes safety of walking across the street.
Yeah.
Are you able to dig a little bit in your research on that, or?
No, not with this, because Walkscore doesn't include anything about safety or presence of sidewalks or crosswalks. I will be, in the rest of my dissertation, looking a little bit more at the specifics of the built environment, and can probably say more about that soon. So stay tuned. Very soon, I hope.
Come on. Anyone? Yeah, good.
So I don't have a clear question, but I was thinking if you have considered lifestyles as expressions of consumer behavior to have some effect on the accessibility of neighborhoods. I mean, because since you are interested in inequality, and as Professor Deal mentioned, probably low-income people, it's not that they have a preference for those types of neighborhoods, but they need to locate in neighborhoods with high access to transit, because probably they only own one car or don't even own any car. So have you seen some sort of difference between or a typology of what you call accessible areas, to find some distinctions between high income people and low income groups?
No, I'm not sure I'm 100% following your question, but I think the answer is no. And so one complexity of this is that when you're asking people about their perceptions, and I found that there weren't differences their preferences, and I wasn't finding differences in people's preferences for accessibility characteristics between the income groups. But the strength of those preferences is a harder thing to measure, so the realization of those preferences is going to have something to do with the strength of them, but what I'm thinking is happening, and which makes sense, is that the other concern is cost, and for lower income people, cost is going to make more of a difference versus those other preferences. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely a complex relationship there.
You know I'm not going to let you go.
So since you brought up the point of equity and transportation and land use, can you speak a little bit further on your thoughts of that and how that can be further integrated?
Oh, I see. Make me talk more. Well, okay. So there was an effort at the start of the Obama administration to have much better alignment between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the U.S. Department of Transportation. And the Environmental Protection Agency as well was in this consortium of federal agencies. And I think there was a lot of potential, and it is a lot of potential, to better align transportation projects and public housing. I don't think, and we have some great examples here in Portland where that's been done. TriMet has used some of their Federal Transit Administration dollars to purchase properties that have then been redeveloped in conjunction with housing providers for low-income households. There's an example up on Interstate when that light rail line went in. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but things have, I think, kind of fizzled out at the federal level because everything at the federal level has fizzled out. But hopefully that's a direction that will move in more integration of those two.
Right now.
Maybe. And if they want to give me research funding, more research funding, that would be great.
So Arlie, what's next in your Wave 2? Can you talk a little bit about how that's different than the data that you have now?
Yeah, so Wave 2, well, for this project is going to go away for a little while, and so Wave 2 is mostly going to be focusing on questions of how people are, rather than looking at this question of barriers, but just looking at how people in general make decisions about transportation and housing kind of in conjunction with one another, and whether people's, so, when you move to a new place, is your travel behavior after you've lived there for a while based more on what you've done in previous places that you've lived, your underlying attitudes, or what you see happening around you, or the built environment itself and what's there on the ground. And then also looking at changes in some of those things like attitudes to see if exposure to these different environments over a period of time can start to shift some of those attitudes. So that's what Wave 2 and the dissertation is going to be all about.
Then bringing it back to this topic, do you have any hypotheses about what the differences might be in that behavioral change between these low-income and high-income groups? Which one do you anticipate changing more, all things equal?
So based on some work that Susan Handy and others did looking at sort of the mismatch between preferences and neighborhoods, didn't look into the income question, but found that people who were in neighborhoods that didn't match up with their preferences were more likely to have, travel further distances. I would expect then that because I'm finding that the lower income households are not able to match up with their preferences as well, that they will either not be able to reduce their car travel or not be able to use active travel modes as much as the higher income people. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I just wonder how different that's going to be than from their previous, if they've always never been able to match. They're sort of in this tactical mode always. They can't be strategic. As opposed to people with more choice, they can be much more strategic about what their goals and so on are. So there might be more change. You could argue it either way.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Well, great. Thanks, Arlie.
Thank you.
Okay, you guys aren't off the hook, though.